The CS time clock is not just a clocking recording device. What distinguishes it from other time clocks is that it also has the ability to process employee hours. By default, the clock is shipped with all the processing features enabled, but we're going to start as if this is not the case. So to configure the processing rules, you need to be able to access the clock's web interface. So I'm going to just quickly log into my clock here. And processing is enabled or disabled under the Processing Global Settings menu. As you can see at the moment, Auto Process is disabled. When auto processing is disabled, it simply calculates the total time between the first in and the last out clocking for the day. If there is no out clocking for the day, it will calculate until the next out clocking, even if that clocking falls on the next day or is a few days later. In other words, it can easily handle night and double shifts. Let's have a look at an example. So if we go to Employees, and let's have a look at Bruce's hours, you can see you just have the 1 hours column with the total hours. And as an example of a double shift, I just want to change our date. Now Bruce clocked in on the 24th at 8:07, and he only clocked out the next day on the 25th at 5:30. And you can see it gives you the total hours worked as 33 hours 23 minutes. Now these total hours are calculated dynamically. In other words, the hours are not saved in the database, but is calculated when you open the daily hours or the payroll hours window. With processing disabled, no public holiday or leave hours will be assigned. If the auto reset clocking direction is enabled, the employee status will be reset to out and outside at midnight. But we're going to go into more depth on the auto reset direction function at a later stage. Let's go back to Global Settings, and I'm going to enable auto processing. Now once processing is enabled, a daily hours record will be created at the beginning of each day, and it is updated automatically when the employee clocks or when a leave record is added. You can force reprocessing when changing employee hours, and you can also override the values in the processed records. Now I'm going to leave all the options in this global settings as it is at the moment, and I'll go through each of these settings during this webinar. When we now look at the employee hours with auto process enabled, you will now see 11 hours columns instead of just 1. Now each of these columns has a fixed meaning which can be manipulated to a certain degree. To make use of those columns, you first need to set up a shift schedule for each of your employees. Now you can create your shift schedules under Processing, Employee Schedules. And I've already created 5 employee schedules to use as examples of how the processing is done. Let's have a look at the rules around your employee schedule. If no schedule is present for an employee, all their hours are allocated to the normal column. So anything between the first in and the last out clocking will be displayed under normal. Please note that your schedules are limited to a 7-day cycle. In your schedule setup, you need to enter a start and an end time for every day that the employee is expected to work. Any time before the start time will be allocated to your extra column. Time between the expected start and end times is allocated to the normal column between Monday and Fridays, and over the weekend it will be allocated to your Sunday or Saturday columns respectively. Anything after your expected end time goes to the overtime column. If both your start and your end times are left at 0, any time worked on that day will be allocated to your overtime column. If you set your start time to 0 and your end time to 23:59, all the time worked on that day will be allocated to your normal, your Saturday or Sunday time, depending on which day of the week it is. Let's have a look at some examples of the hours for employees who's got employee schedules assigned to them. Now this employee does not have an employee schedule assigned, and if we just have a look at 1 week to make it easier to see, you will see that all his hours worked goes into the normal column. An employee with a schedule, this employee is expected to work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Any time worked before the scheduled start time goes into extra. Time worked between the scheduled start and end times go to normal, and anything after your scheduled end time goes into the overtime column. On a day without a schedule or without expected hours, on which your start and your end times are both 0, any time worked will be allocated to your overtime column. This employee schedule has the Saturday and the Sunday time set up with a start time of 0 and an end time of 23:59. And as you can see, all the hours are allocated to the Saturday column. If any deductions have to be made from the employee's total time worked, you can enter the total under the lunch column. So if we just go back to our employee schedules, the lunch time will be deducted from your time worked between the scheduled start and end time. If the employees worked less than the lunch deduction, only the time worked will be deducted. And the lunch time will be deducted regardless if your employee clocked for it or not. If an employee clocks out for a break, he or she will lose the time they were clocked out for, as well as the lunch time if any has been specified. It is therefore important to decide whether you will make use of your lunch entry or not, as your employees have to either clock out for their unpaid breaks or not at all. Now, if we can have a look at our lunch schedule example, on the 1st of June, this employee clocked out at 12 and clocked back in for 12:30. The employee schedule already has an unpaid lunch of 30 minutes. The time clocked out for, as well as the lunch break, has been deducted from the total normal time. I'm just going to go back to our employee schedules again. Now, you can also see here your expected hours column. And the hours column is used for the allocation of your public holiday hours, your leave hours, daily balancing, and also to determine absenteeism. So if the value in the hours column for the day is greater than 0, the employee will be seen as absent if no clockings exist for the day. And if I can just show you a quick example again, we go to employees. You'll see here that Nathan was expected to clock in at 8, clock out at 5, but there are no clockings for the day, and he is therefore seen as absent. Now at the bottom of your employee schedule, you have the options to override your global processing settings for this specific employer only. But let's go back to our global processor settings to have a look at the meaning of each of these. We're going to now look at the auto reset clocking direction. If the auto reset clocking direction is enabled and the employee did not clock out by the end of the day, his or her clocking direction and area will be set to out and outside. In other words, their next clocking will be an in clocking. Now let's examine the term end of the day a bit further once processing is enabled. The end of the day is determined as follows. If no schedule exists for the employee, the end of day is midnight. If a schedule exists, then the end of day is the midpoint of the start and the end times plus 12 hours. Now if I can show you this as an example, this schedule has a start time of 8 a.m. and the end time is 5 p.m. So the midpoint is 12:30. Now if we add 12 hours, the end of day is seen as 30 minutes past midnight. Now the auto reset direction function only changes the employee's clocking status at the end of the day. If no outclocking exists after an in-clocking, no hours will be calculated for that employee. And this is where the auto end day feature comes in. If the auto end day feature is enabled and the employee did not clock out by the end of the day, the clock will assume that the employee clocked out at his or her scheduled end time and then will calculate the employee's hours accordingly. Now please note, for this function to work, a schedule with a start and an end time must exist for the employee. And just to show you an example again, Nathan did clock in at 7:24 on the 14th, but there's no outclocking and is expected to work until 5 p.m. So what the clock did, it was to process his normal hours until 5 p.m. Next up is balancing. Overtime balancing can be enabled on your employee daily hours. So if it is enabled, your employee will not receive overtime until their expected hours have been filled. Now I'm going to show you an example again. So if we go back to our web interface, and just view for 1 week. On the 10th, you can see that the employee clocked in late, but worked past the expected end time. So and overtime balancing is enabled on this employee schedule. So the clock used the overtime to fill their normal time, and what is left over is still displayed under overtime. Now it is also possible to set up a schedule where your start and your end times has a period longer than your expected hours. In that case, if your employee exceeds the expected hours under normal, the overtime will be sent to the overtime column. As an example of that, let's go have a look at this employee. This employee has a schedule that starts at 6 in the morning and ends at 5 in the afternoon with a 1-hour lunch break. Almost every single day, the employee has worked more than 8 hours and the excess time has been sent to the overtime column.